Republican Representative George Anthony Santos first stepped into politics during his 2020 bid for New York's 3rd Congressional District, dropping out just 2 weeks after announcing his run.
Santos threw his hat back in the ring for the 2022 election cycle, which made history as the first U.S. congressional race between two openly gay men. Santos won by 7% against his Democratic opponent in the 2022 midterms.
Recently, the Long Island Republican has made headlines after various lies regarding his religion, ethnicity, education, and career have been revealed.
Despite many calls by his constituents and state party officials for his resignation, Santos still holds his position as a representative for New York's 3rd Congressional District.
As more of Santos's lies come to light, the question remains, how did he get this far? More importantly, what systems should be put in place to ensure this doesn't happen again? And what will voters decide if he does run for a re-election next year?
All this and much more right now on That Point. Good evening and welcome to On That Point. I'm Kevin Boulandier.
And I'm Allison Ouellette. Months before Santos won his election and the lies were revealed, a small Long Island paper called the North Shore Leader broke the Santos story before anyone else. We are joined now by Grant Lally, the publisher of the North Shore Leader, who published the story exposing Representative Santos's fraudulent financial claims.
George Santos became a national figure after the New York Times wrote a story about his false resume. But months before, a small Long Island paper called the North Shore Leader broke the Santos scandal before anyone else. The publisher of that outlet, Grant Lally, joins us now to discuss. Grant Lally, thank you so much for joining me today.
Kevin, it's great to be here.
So let's start here. Your newspaper's story reported primarily on the financing of Santos' campaign. It didn't really include many of the most egregious lies and distortions on his resume or his alleged criminal fraud in Brazil. Were there any sources relaying that relevant information to your paper, or was your team interested solely on the campaign finance issues?
Well, what we saw were two things. We saw him personally in the district lying left, right, and center to everyone, making up crazy stories about what a rich Brazilian finance executive he was, and how he owned mansions all across the North Shore of Long Island and had Maseratis and was a multi-millionaire. But the guy we saw, none of that fit. He didn't own any of these properties that he claimed he owned. And he would literally point houses out to people and say, oh, I own that mansion over there. And he didn't own it. So that's what we saw. Because we already knew he was really a liar, we dug into his finances, and what we saw was huge discrepancies between what he was claiming he was worth and also what he claimed he was spending on his campaign. And those are mandatory disclosures. That's the law. And if you lie on those, it's a federal felony. So he was lying on those, and we knew it because we could see on the ground that he wasn't spending money like he said he was, that he was claiming to own things he didn't own, and it was obviously a huge problem.
Right. Let's go on to the vetting of it. You've gained experience in politics with your own congressional run in 2014. How are political candidates typically vetted?
Well, with Santos, it's a complicated situation because he was originally running as what they call a sacrificial lamb, meaning he was not going to win the election. He was someone running for a district that at the time was overwhelmingly Democratic, and he was going to lose. But what happened, he was running, and he was really running as a financial scam. He was looking to get money from wealthy people and then skim for himself off of those monies. But what happened is in June of 2022, just 7 months ago, the top court in New York ripped up the old map, which made his district a very Democratic district, and redrew the map. And they said that the old map had been heavily gerrymandered and it was illegal. So they ordered a new map drawn. The new map changed the district to a slightly Republican district. So suddenly Santos, the sacrificial lamb, became Santos running for a Republican district.
Very interesting, very interesting. It seems oppositional research is now going to intensify in political elections. Following Santos' election, do you think the electorate can continue to rely on the Democratic and Republican National Committee's efforts? Or should new mechanisms be put in place to vet candidates, perhaps ones that operate outside the two major political parties?
More information is always good, and that is, that was what was really needed in the Santos race. But let me go back to the media as well. I mean, we as the local newspaper who cover the North Shore, Gold Coast of Long Island, we saw this directly, and we published multiple stories about his lies and his deceptions. We called him a fabulist. We called him a fraud. We reported what a lot of people were already calling him, which was George Scamtos. And that was out there. That was out there 2 months before the election. The real failure was that other media didn't pick up on this, and that's the multiple daily papers in New York, and also the regional broadcast media didn't pick up on it, and that's a problem.
Speaking about your paper, the North Shore Leader, you've covered the Long Island area for years. And when you're out there now, after this story already broke, how are Santos constituents currently reacting to the pattern of deceit as it continues to unfold?
People are really furious. They feel they've been conned, that a con man has pulled it over on them, and they are, they're very angry. They want him to resign. I don't know anybody who doesn't want him gone. That's Republicans, it's Democrats, it's independents. Everyone wants to be rid of this guy, and it's not just he's a con man. He's a decades-long criminal, and I have met people he has stolen money from, including a disabled United States Navy veteran who had raised $3,000 for emergency surgery on his service dog. Santos stole that $3,000. The service dog did not get the surgery, and the dog died. And this veteran, who already had a lot of problems in his life, was crushed and was suicidal for quite a long time. So it's not like Santos. This isn't cute. This guy, Santos, is pure evil. He's a sociopath, and he doesn't mind hurting people.
Wow. So let's talk about the media again. Your paper, like you said, broke the Santos story before the November election. However, the story didn't gain national attention until much later when the New York Times picked it up well after he was elected. Why do you think the biggest news outlets didn't pay attention?
Well, it's a couple of reasons. One is because a lot of the media hadn't picked up on the fact that the June redistricting by New York's top court had changed the nature of the district from a very safe Democratic seat to a Republican seat. The other thing is that there were so many other hot elections in New York this past year, with a very hot governor's race that was only a couple of points at the end of the day, and many close congressional races. And the Republicans picked up 5 or 6 seats in New York State alone this past cycle, and all of those were close races. So when with limited resources, the local media was divided in what races to cover. We had the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, the DCCC's chairman in the Hudson Valley, running for re-election, and the Republican challenger actually beat him in that election.
Right. But how can we ensure that important news stories like this one reach a national audience, even when those stories come from relatively small news outlets?
It's the eternal question, and it's really about resources, and it's about the major local media, meaning daily newspapers and broadcast television, committing the resources to be able to look into these kinds of stories and also be receptive to these kinds of stories. I mean, news reporting has changed. A lot of news reporters are very lazy, and if they can't search for the information on the internet, well, it just doesn't happen. And there are fewer good reporters out there. I mean, I remember 20 years ago, one of the major daily newspapers that covers Long Island, they had a whole team of really good, smart, capable political reporters who knew what was going on, who knew the real story, who didn't just take the press release and reprint it, but knew what the real story was behind the news. And that I don't see. I mean, if there's one change, that's what I do see, is that aspect of news reporting has collapsed.
Well, to expand on that, many people say, oh, the local news is dying. There are multiple efforts being put into it. But when you see something like this happen, where your paper reports something and it doesn't get picked up and it was an important story, what does this say about the role of local news?
Well, this is it. I mean, what we reported this because we are on the ground. We have an office in the district. We could look out the door and see when Santos was claiming he was spending $1.5 million campaigning in the district. We could look out the door and there's nothing there. There are no lawn signs. There's no campaign headquarters. There's nothing on television in the district. There's nothing in people's mailboxes. So what happened to that 1.5 million? And then he claimed he spent another 1.5 million from September 1st on to the election day. But we looked at it and we said, no. This is more like 500,000. So where did that other 1 million go? Was it real? Was it fake? Was it all skimmed off to consultants? I mean, that's what we could see, but you need someone on the ground, not someone clicking at a computer in a back office in Washington, D.C. or working remotely. You need to see what's going on.
Right. Let's go back to the story on the paper on your paper, the story that we reported on. Days ago, a former aide of Santos came forward, claiming that Santos had sexually harassed him. Given Santos' mounting ethical dilemmas, do you think he'll serve out his term?
Look, he has many problems, but many legal problems, and these would be all felonies in his campaign disclosures and the lies he put into his campaign filings and his personal financial disclosure filings, which are filed with the U.S. House of Representatives. Misrepresentations in those filings, each one is a felony that could get him 5 years in federal prison. But even more serious to me are the street crimes, the petty, nasty street crimes that he committed, stealing the $3,500 from the disabled American veteran. There was a story out yesterday, again, broken by a local reporter here on Long Island, not one of ours, but a really good reporter, and named Jackie Sweet. And she broke the story that Santos had passed bad checks to Amish people in Pennsylvania in order to get his hands on some dogs and puppies, which he then brought to New York and sold for cash. And the check he issued to the breeders bounced. He then swore that they were stolen checks that someone else forged. But of course, he took the dogs and he sold the dogs and he kept all the money. Wow. So those are street crimes. That's just straight out fraud, charities fraud, larceny, theft. So they are looking. I know that the FBI and local district's attorney are looking into this, and those are easy to prove. You don't have to have a forensic accountant look at that. That's just straight out theft. And he is a criminal. I mean, he stole in Brazil. He stole women's jewelry and went to pawn shops. He accessed people's bank accounts and stole money from those bank accounts. One of the Brazilian news reporters described him to me as a 20-year petty crime wave all by himself.
Wow, well, we'll see where it all goes. We'll leave it right there. Thank you so much, Mr. Lally, for joining us today.
Thanks, Kevin.
Congressman George Santos's lies began before he even set foot in Washington. His campaign website said that he worked as an associate asset manager at New York investment banks Citigroup and Goldman Sachs. A few months into his campaign, Santos said in a WNYC radio interview that he had lost 4 of his employees in the 2016 Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando, Florida. The New York Times reported later that none of the victims had any connection with the companies named in his biography. About a week later, Santos admitted in an exclusive with the New York Post that he was lying about being employed at either company. His website also said that his mother was in the South Tower of the World Trade Center when it was struck by a plane on 9/11. However, in a visa application she had filed to enter the U.S. in 2003, his mom said she had left the United States in 1999 and hadn't returned since. While campaigning, he had also claimed to run a nonprofit called Friends of Pets United, but there's no record of it in the IRS's system. In January of 2023, a U.S. Navy veteran named Richard Ossoff told Patch Media that Santos said he'd raised $3,000 to pay the vet bills of Ossoff's service dog who had cancer, but he never saw any of that money. Santos was charged in 2017 in Pennsylvania for allegedly scamming Amish dog breeders out of puppies using $15,000 in fraudulent checks. Days after 9 checks in Santos' name had bounced, Friends of Pets United held an adoption event at a pet store in Staten Island. Santos says that his checkbook was stolen and he never made any of those purchases. The charges were later dropped. Santos is now defending himself from allegations of sexual harassment from a former staffer and a probe from the House Ethics Committee. Back to you, Kevin.
Thank you, Alex. A recent study from Psychiatric Research and Clinical Practice found that 13% of 807 participants self-identified as pathological liars. We wanted to investigate the specifics and reasoning behind pathological lying and the behavioral cues of deception. Allison spoke to Dr. Christian Hart, a professor and director of psychological science at Texas Women's University, who is currently advocating to include pathological lying as a standalone mental illness.
I'm here with Dr. Christian Hart, professor of psychological science at Texas Women's University. Dr. Hart, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Great. Now, we wanted to start with just some preliminary overarching questions. So I wanted to start by asking you, what creates a pathological liar? And is pathological lying a learned pattern or is it biological?
Well, I guess those questions are kind of related to each other. So, how does a pathological liar become a pathological liar? We have some evidence that dishonesty is a heritable trait, which means that it's coded in one's genes. And so if someone's biological parents are extremely dishonest, there's an increased probability that those offspring will also be dishonest. And so there is some evidence of a biological heredity with it, but most of the evidence suggests that pathological liars emerge due to experiences they have in their environment. Most people start lying when they're around ages 2 or 3, and most kids start lying more and more to the point where when they're in late adolescence, they're kind of at their peak levels of lying. But for most people, they kind of taper off. But some people don't. Some people persist in this prodigious amount of lying. And some of the environmental factors that seem to be key is living in a household where dishonesty is prevalent. So some parents kind of indoctrinate their children into this pattern of dishonesty. Also siblings, being in a home with a sibling who's a liar increases the odds that someone will be a liar. And then also being in friendships with people who are extremely dishonest increases the odds as well. We also see some evidence that harsh punitive environments seem to foster dishonesty. So if someone is, for example, at a school or in a home where they're regularly punished harshly for their misbehaviors, they're much more likely to engage in prolific patterns of lying.
Right. So it's like that age-old nature versus nurture debate.
Yeah, exactly.
So then I wanted to move on. What is the difference between someone who lies and a pathological liar?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's really a bit of an arbitrary cutoff point. We all lie. When we ask people over a 1-week span of time, have you lied this week? What we find is that over 95% of people say yes. And if we look a little bit closer, we can see that there's a great deal of variability in how much people lie. And so the typical person over a 24-hour period of time, if we ask them, have you lied within the past 24 hours? The most common response is no, I've told 0 lies. But some people, when they answer that question, say, I've told 20 lies. And so we see this great deal of variability. And so what we've tried to do, my co-author Drew Curtis and I, is we tried to discern what's a reasonable cutoff point where we can sort of separate the masses of kind of generally dishonest people who tell an occasional lie here and there from pathological liars. And so pathological lying is just a pattern of excessive lying that tends to cause problems in people's lives and problems for the people around them. And we've kind of settled in on this point. We've figured this a number of different ways, but we 5 or more lies per day seems to be a pretty reasonable number of lies to classify someone as a pathological liar.
And with that, this question kind of goes into that. What symptoms or behaviors would you say are required for a diagnosis of being a pathological liar?
Pathological lying isn't included yet in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual put forth by the American Psychiatric Association. And so we're kind of advocating that perhaps we should give it another look as being a standalone disorder. And the way that we characterize pathological lying is that it's excessive lying, that is, it's abnormal in its frequency. It tends to cause problems in the people's lives or the people around them. And so we refer to that as dysfunction. So it disrupts oftentimes social relationships, work performance, things like that. It often causes emotional negative reactions for the person. So they're having like distress. They want to stop lying, but they can't. And it persists for a long period of time. Typically has an onset during childhood, but we kind of have a more recent cutoff. But as with most psychological disorders, we look for a persistence over the period of months or years.
Yeah. And kind of shifting into politics a little bit, what would you say is the motive of someone who is a pathological liar, especially in the realm of politics?
When we look at why anyone lies, we characterize it as being the result of 3 key elements. One is they see some sort of incentive. That is, they believe something desirable is going to happen if they lie that wouldn't happen if they were honest. And so they see some sort of utility in lying. The second part is they believe that they're going to get away with it, or at least they believe that the consequences if they get caught will be tolerable. And then the third is they can morally justify their lying. That is, they can look themselves in the mirror and still view themselves in a positive way. And so that seems to be the motivational structure for why most people lie. Politics is a difficult profession to be in and be entirely honest all of the time. And so I like to think of other jobs where complete dishonesty is problematic. Like if you're trying to sell a product and you know it to be an inferior product, it'd be very difficult to do that and remain honest and do the job effectively. But within politics, people are trying to satisfy many constituencies at the same time. And that's a really challenging thing to do if one's honest. And so as a result, many politicians bend the truth, they exaggerate, they minimize problems, and sometimes they just say things that are outright false.
And with all of that, this kind of system that you've been talking about, when does it cross the line to become dangerous, do you think?
Well, it depends on whose perspective you're looking at. When liars lie, many times they justify the lying by assuring themselves that what they're doing isn't really all that bad, or that they're really not causing that much harm to people. However, if you ask the people who are being lied to, they tend to have a much different perspective, and they see the lying as much more harmful and much more morally egregiously wrong. And so when does it become a problem? I think if you're asking voters, they'll say, if you're lying in a way that's causing me to vote for you when I otherwise wouldn't, then it's a problem.
Do you think that overall politics creates liars or attracts them?
The research that's been done on this indicates that most people who move into politics are just as honest as any typical individual. And so it doesn't seem to be the case that politics attracts dishonest people. It seems that the job of being a politician drives people toward greater and greater patterns of dishonesty. And so what we see is that while people who move into politics tend to be pretty honest, those people who stay in politics and succeed in politics, namely by being reelected, tend to be those people who are more comfortable being less truthful.
Mm. Now, finally, I know that you might not have an answer for this one because your research isn't necessarily focused on politics, but I wanted to ask, do you see a future where legislation is passed to reduce this type of lying in the government?
I'm skeptical. I think dishonesty in politics, or dishonesty has always been prevalent in politics. If we look at politics, it's in many ways a game of psychological and social manipulation. Politicians are many times honestly trying to manipulate people to vote for a particular agenda or a particular political candidate. And sometimes that manipulation involves exaggerations and bending the truth, and sometimes it involves outright lying. I think it's just like any other domain of life. It's really hard to ban dishonesty. We can put in place structures to try to minimize it, but I think people will use their votes to influence dishonesty, and it appears that in our political discourse right now, voters are perfectly willing to tolerate dishonesty in the people who are representing them.
Right. Well, thank you so much for your time and expertise, Dr. Hart. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Yeah, well, I've had a great time talking with you, so thanks for having me.
Ça va, très bien. Pierre Dilecto, au revoir, darling.